Tonight, we drift into the quiet heart of the Mojave, where bright lights mask older hungers. Beyond the clatter of casinos and the steady glow of the Strip lies a society defined by silence, refinement, and carefully hidden memory. The White Glove Society appears calm, orderly, and civilized, moving through marble halls with practiced grace. Yet beneath the gloves and masks rests a past shaped by scarcity, ritual, and survival. This is not a tale of sudden violence, but of slow transformation. As the world ended and rebuilt itself unevenly, this society learned how to endure by concealing its origins. Long before the lights of the Strip cut through the desert night, the Mojave was a place shaped almost entirely by absence. After the Great War reduced cities to ash and scattered populations across broken ground, survival became the only remaining structure. Roads no longer led anywhere predictable. Old borders dissolved into dust. What remained were small groups of people moving carefully through ruins, guided not by law or memory of nations, but by the immediate needs of hunger, shelter, and safety. Food was never guaranteed. The land offered little beyond scrub, irradiated animals, and the remnants of pre-war supplies that grew rarer with each passing year. For many, scavenging was not an occupation but a daily ritual, repeated until nothing useful could be found. Crops struggled in poisoned soil, herds were small and dangerous to hunt. Trade existed, but only between groups that could afford trust, and trust was expensive. In these early decades, morality did not resemble the systems remembered from before the bombs. There were no courts, no shared codes beyond what a group could enforce within itself. Actions were judged almost entirely by outcome. If something kept people alive, it was permitted. If it endangered the group, it was rejected. This quiet, practical logic shaped the cultures that emerged across the Mojave, each adapting in different ways to the same unyielding conditions. Some tribes turned inward, becoming insular and defensive. Others grew aggressive, taking what they needed through force. A few developed elaborate customs and rituals, using structure and symbolism to replace the institutions that had been lost. In every case, survival demanded compromise. Old taboos faded when weighed against starvation. Practices once unthinkable became normalized through repetition. Cannibalism, in particular, emerged not as an act of cruelty, but as an answer to scarcity. In a world where death was constant and bodies were often left unburied, the boundary between the living and the dead became less rigid. For some groups, consuming the dead was framed as respect, a way of ensuring that nothing was wasted. For others, it was a guarded secret, practiced only when no alternatives remained. Over time, in certain tribes, it evolved further, becoming ritualized and woven into identity rather than desperation. These practices did not appear suddenly, nor were they universally accepted. They developed slowly, shaped by repeated loss and the steady erosion of pre-war values. Each generation grew up with fewer stories of the old world and more experience of a harsh present. Children learned early that survival required difficult choices and that comfort was rare. In this environment, tradition formed quickly, reinforced by necessity rather than reflection. The Mojave itself reinforced these patterns. Wide open spaces made isolation common. Ruins provided shelter, but also reminders of a world that no longer functioned. Technology lingered without instruction manuals or stable power, creating a landscape where advanced machines coexisted with primitive living. This contrast made the past feel distant and unreachable, even when its remains were close at hand. Over time, tribes adapted their beliefs to fit the land. Food became sacred, regardless of its source. Waste was discouraged, sometimes punished. The dead were honored in ways that reflected practicality as much as reverence. Identity became tightly bound to shared hardship, and deviation from group norms was seen as a threat to survival itself. In the absence of larger authority, leadership often fell to those who could provide stability. This did not always mean strength or intelligence. Sometimes it meant the ability to enforce rules consistently or to interpret tradition in a way that justified hard decisions. Leaders became keepers of custom, deciding which practices were necessary and which could be discarded. Over time, these decisions hardened into doctrine. It was within this environment that the ancestors of the White Glove Society lived and adapted. They were not unique in facing hunger, nor in crossing lines that the old world would have condemned. What distinguished them was not the act itself, but the way it was incorporated into social order. Cannibalism was not chaos. It was regulated, structured, and surrounded by meaning. It became a way to define who belonged and who did not. These early tribes did not imagine a future of marble halls or fine clothing. Their concerns were immediate and practical. Yet the customs they formed would persist long after the original reasons had faded. As conditions slowly changed and new powers emerged in the Mojave, these traditions would be challenged, suppressed, and reshaped. But they would not disappear. The wasteland does not erase history. It preserves it in altered forms, carried forward by people who adapt without fully letting go. Long before the Strip offered comfort and excess, the foundations of the White Glove Society were already being laid, shaped by hunger, silence, and the quiet logic of survival. As the years passed and survival settled into routine, some tribes began to distinguish themselves not by strength or territory, but by cohesion. Among these was the group that would one day become known as the White Glove Society. In the early Mojave, they were not yet refined or hidden behind ritual politeness. They were a small, tightly bound tribe whose identity was shaped by shared secrecy and carefully maintained boundaries. Little is known of their original name, and what remains has likely been lost by design. Names carried power, and this tribe learned early that power was best controlled. What can be traced instead is their structure. Unlike loosely organized bands, they emphasized internal order. Membership was clearly defined. Outsiders were observed, evaluated, and rarely trusted. Within the group, roles were assigned early, often passed down rather than chosen. This created continuity in a world where little endured. Cannibalism, within this tribe, was neither desperate nor random. It was regulated. Consumption followed rules, observed only under specific circumstances, and was framed as a shared responsibility rather than indulgence. The act itself was not discussed openly. Silence surrounded it, reinforced by ritual and hierarchy. To speak of it casually was to misunderstand its place within the tribe. This practice served several purposes. Practically, it ensured survival during periods of extreme scarcity. Symbolically, it reinforced unity. To partake was to belong. To refuse was to distance oneself from the group. Over time, this created a strong internal bond, one that discouraged dissent and rewarded obedience. Identity became inseparable from participation. The tribe's social structure reflected this philosophy. Leadership was concentrated among elders who acted as interpreters of tradition. Their authority did not come from physical dominance, but from knowledge. They remembered why certain rules existed, even as the original reasons faded. Through them, the past remained present, shaping decisions long after the circumstances had changed. Ritual played a central role. Meals were not taken lightly. Preparation followed prescribed steps, and consumption was often accompanied by gestures meant to acknowledge loss rather than celebrate it. These practices allowed the tribe to frame cannibalism as something solemn and necessary, rather than savage. It became a cultural constant, stripped of chaos and absorbed into daily life. Children grew up within this system, without question. By the time they were old enough to understand, the practice felt ordinary. Stories of the old world carried little weight compared to lived experience. What mattered was continuity. To survive meant to follow the rules that had already proven effective. The tribe's isolation reinforced these patterns. They did not wander far, preferring familiar ground where routines could be maintained. Contact with other groups was limited and cautious. When encounters occurred, they were brief and controlled. Outsiders were never shown the full extent of the tribe's customs. Secrecy was protection. Over generations, this secrecy became instinctive. Information was shared selectively, even among members. Not everyone knew everything. This layered knowledge ensured that no single individual could threaten the whole. It also cultivated an atmosphere of quiet restraint. Curiosity was discouraged. Compliance was valued. As the Mojave slowly began to change, with rumors of restored power grids and organized settlements spreading through the desert, the tribe remained largely untouched. They observed these developments from a distance, neither embracing nor rejecting them. Their concern was not progress, but preservation. The outside world was unpredictable. Their own customs, however severe, were familiar. Yet, even within this stability, subtle tensions existed. Not all members experienced the same relationship to tradition. Some followed ritual without reflection. Others questioned privately but remained silent. These differences rarely surfaced, but they accumulated quietly, waiting for conditions to shift. The tribe did not seek expansion. Growth risked dilution. Instead, they focused inward, refining their practices and strengthening internal bonds. This inward focus would later make them attractive to those who valued control and predictability. When the forces that would eventually create New Vegas began to take shape, the tribe was already prepared in ways others were not. They understood hierarchy. They respected rules imposed from above. They knew how to suppress instinct in favor of order. These qualities would soon make them valuable. At this stage, however, they were still simply a tribe shaped by the Mojave. Their customs were not judged by outside standards, because few outsiders knew of them. Cannibalism was not yet a secret to be hidden behind luxury. It was an accepted part of life, governed by restraint and meaning. This early foundation explains much of what the White Glove Society would later become. Their obsession with control, their reliance on ritual, and their ability to conceal disturbing truths beneath polished surfaces all trace back to these origins. What would change was not their nature, but the environment in which it was expressed. Long before they wore gloves or served meals beneath chandeliers, they learned how to survive by controlling hunger, information, and identity. Those lessons would endure, even as everything else was stripped away or replaced. While tribes adapted slowly across the Mojave, one figure remained untouched by hunger, exposure, or time. Robert House had not survived the Great War by chance. He endured because he planned for a future that extended far beyond his own body. From within sealed chambers, sustained by machines and calculation, House watched the wastelands settle into patterns. Where others saw chaos, he saw variables. Where tribes struggled to survive season to season, he measured decades. House's vision for New Vegas was not born from nostalgia. He did not seek to restore the old world as it had been. Instead, he aimed to preserve what he considered functional while discarding the rest. Efficiency mattered more than morality. Stability mattered more than freedom. Civilization, in his design, was not a shared ideal, but a managed condition. For generations, the Strip had remained dormant, its structures intact but powerless. House waited until the Mojave reached a point of exhaustion. When the wasteland had organized itself into predictable factions and trade routes, he began to act. Power was restored. Securitrons emerged. The Strip was cleared and reshaped into a controlled space, separate from the surrounding desert. House understood that machines alone could not maintain order. People were required, but not just any people. He did not want settlers who would question authority or tribes that clung too tightly to autonomy. He needed groups that could be reshaped, guided, and contained. To accomplish this, he turned to the tribes already occupying the region. House's selection process was deliberate. He observed how each tribe governed itself, how it enforced rules, and how it responded to hierarchy. Strength was less important than compliance. Creativity was less valuable than predictability. Tribes that thrived through internal discipline rather than aggression drew his attention. The tribe that would become the White Glove Society stood out in these observations. They were structured, insular, and accustomed to secrecy. Their rituals demonstrated restraint rather than excess. Most importantly, they already understood the importance of rules that were not openly discussed. This made them adaptable to House's requirements. House did not approach these tribes with diplomacy in the traditional sense. He offered survival in exchange for transformation. His message was simple. The strip would endure. Those who wished to be part of it would abandon certain practices and adopt new ones. Those who refused would remain outside, subject to the uncertainties of the Mojave. This was not presented as coercion, but as inevitability. House did not threaten, he calculated. The tribes were shown what the strip could offer: permanent shelter, steady resources, protection from raiders and rival factions. For groups accustomed to scarcity, the promise was difficult to ignore. At the same time, the cost was clear. Tribal identities would be erased, old names would be discarded. Customs deemed incompatible with House's image of New Vegas would be forbidden. The tribes would be reshaped into themed families, each serving a specific aesthetic function within the strip. House's vision required spectacle as much as order. The strip was designed to appear vibrant and indulgent, masking the careful control beneath it. Each family would contribute to this illusion in its own way. Some would embody entertainment, others would represent excess. The tribe chosen to inhabit the ultra-luxe would represent refinement. This assignment was not accidental. House recognized that the former tribe's emphasis on ritual and restraint could be redirected into etiquette and presentation. Their ability to suppress instinct could be reframed as sophistication. Their secrecy could become discretion. Where other tribes might resist such transformation, this one was uniquely prepared to accept it. House did not concern himself with the tribe's internal beliefs, only their outward behavior. He did not ask them to forget their past. He asked them to conceal it. This distinction mattered. Suppression was easier than erasure. As long as the strip remained orderly, what happened behind closed doors was of little interest to him. The agreement between House and the tribe marked a turning point. In exchange for security and status, the tribe accepted a new identity. They would become hosts rather than hunters, servers rather than survivors. Cannibalism, once central to their culture, would be prohibited. Publicly, it would cease to exist. House understood that forcing moral reform outright often led to resistance. Instead, he relied on environment. Within the ultra-luxe, food would be abundant. Luxury would dull memory. New rituals would replace old ones. Over time, House believed the past would lose its hold, yet House also knew that control was never absolute. His system accounted for deviation, not by preventing it, but by containing it. The strip functioned as a series of compartments. Each family was isolated, monitored, and replaceable. If one failed, another could take its place. In this framework, the White Glove Society was both valuable and expendable. They were chosen because they fit the image House required, not because he trusted them. Their survival depended entirely on their ability to maintain appearances. As New Vegas rose from the desert, the tribe stepped into their new role. They traded survival rituals for table settings, silence for smiles, and hunger for abundance. To House, this was progress. To the tribe, it was adaptation. The vision of New Vegas did not erase the Mojave. It reorganized it. Old instincts were not destroyed. They were buried beneath structure and luxury. And in that carefully managed environment, the foundations of the White Glove Society were set. Poised between obedience and memory, refinement and restraint. The first contact between the tribe and the forces representing Robert House did not resemble a negotiation between equals. It unfolded quietly, without ceremony, and without urgency. House's envoys arrived not as conquerors, but as observers. They brought no weapons on display, no demands delivered with raised voices. Instead, they carried information and the confidence that came with knowing the future before it arrived. For the tribe, this encounter was unsettling. They had survived by limiting exposure, by keeping distance from outsiders whose intentions could not be read. Yet these visitors did not behave like raiders or traders. They asked measured questions. They studied routines. They watched how authority functioned within the group. Their interest was not in what the tribe possessed, but in how it operated. Communication was careful on both sides. The tribe's leaders spoke little, offering answers that revealed structure without revealing belief. They had learned long ago that words could endanger as much as weapons. The envoys, for their part, did not press for confessions. They already knew much of what they needed. Surveillance and long observation had filled in most of the gaps. What the envoys offered was not framed as rescue, it was presented as alignment. The strip, they explained, was returning. Power, shelter, and permanence would soon be restored to a place that had stood dormant since before the war. Those who joined early would benefit most. Those who declined would remain as they were, subject to the same uncertainties that had always governed the Mojave. The tribe listened without visible reaction. They understood offers. Trade had always involved compromise, but this proposal was different. It did not ask for resources, it asked for transformation. The envoys described a future where hunger would no longer dictate behavior, where food would be plentiful and reliable. In such a future, old survival practices would no longer be necessary. This implication was deliberate. Cannibalism was never mentioned directly, but it was clearly understood. The tribe's leaders recognized the offer for what it was, a request to abandon the practice that had defined them for generations. They simply framed it as incompatible with the environment House was creating. To refuse was possible. No threat was issued, but refusal meant remaining outside a system that was about to reshape the region. The tribe had survived the Mojave when nothing else existed. Now something was emerging that could not be ignored. The leaders withdrew to consider. This deliberation was not dramatic. There were no arguments shouted or ultimatums declared. Discussion followed the same quiet structure that governed all major decisions. Elders spoke, younger members listened. The question was not whether the old ways were right or wrong. The question was whether they were still necessary. Abundance had always been theoretical. The promise of consistent food challenged a foundational assumption of their culture. If hunger could be eliminated, what would remain of the rituals built around it? Identity, once forged through scarcity, would need a new anchor. When the envoys returned, the tribe did not answer immediately. Instead, they asked questions. How permanent was this arrangement? Who controlled the strip? What happened if rules were broken? The envoys answered plainly. Control rested with House. Rules would be enforced. The strip was stable by design. This clarity was persuasive. The tribe was accustomed to systems where rules were enforced internally. External authority was unfamiliar, but not inherently threatening. What mattered was consistency. House offered a predictable structure, something rare in the wasteland. The most difficult condition was delivered last. To live on the strip, certain practices would be forbidden, not discouraged, forbidden. The envoys did not explain why. They did not negotiate exceptions. This was the cost of entry. Silence followed. For the tribe, this was not simply a behavioral adjustment. It was an existential shift. Cannibalism was not indulgence. It was tradition, memory, and control. Yet the leaders also understood that traditions survived only as long as conditions supported them. The decision, when it came, was framed as continuity rather than surrender. The tribe would endure. That had always been the priority. The form of endurance would change, but survival would remain. They would accept House's terms, not because they agreed with them, but because adaptation had always defined them. The envoys acknowledged the agreement without celebration. There was no ceremony marking the end of the tribe's old life. There was only instruction. The tribe would be relocated. They would receive training. They would be given a new identity suitable for the role they were to play. Preparation began almost immediately. Members were taught etiquette, language, and presentation. Clothing replaced symbols, masks replaced faces, gloves covered hands that had once carried out rituals now deemed unacceptable. These changes were not explained in moral terms. They were explained as necessary for function. Throughout this process, the tribe remained outwardly compliant. Internally, memory persisted. No one forgot the old ways simply because they were no longer practiced openly. Suppression did not erase knowledge, it only redirected it. The first contact with House's envoys marked the beginning of a long transformation. It was not sudden, it was methodical, unfolding through instruction, repetition, and enforced routine. The tribe did not resist openly. Resistance would have been inefficient. As they moved toward the strip, leaving familiar ground behind, the tribe carried more than possessions. They carried a history that could not be displayed, only contained. The agreement with House had ensured their survival, but it had also placed a boundary around their identity. What they were becoming was clear. What they had been was not forgotten. Between those two states, the white glove society began to take shape, defined as much by what it concealed as by what it presented to the world. The agreement with Robert House was simple in its wording and vast in its consequences. It did not unfold as a dramatic moment, but as a gradual restructuring of life. Once accepted, there was no ceremony to mark the transition, no final meal to commemorate the end of the old ways. Instead, the bargain settled in quietly, reshaping routines one rule at a time. The most significant demand was absolute. Cannibalism was no longer permitted, not as necessity, not as ritual, not in secrecy. Within the walls of the strip, it would not exist. The tribe was not asked to explain its past or renounce it publicly. They were instructed to behave as though it had never been part of them at all. For a culture built on controlled hunger, this requirement was disorienting. Cannibalism had never been indulgent or chaotic. It was regulated, bound by tradition, and reinforced through silence. Removing it meant removing more than a practice. It meant dismantling a structure that had governed behavior, hierarchy, and belonging. House did not concern himself with how the tribe would manage this loss. He offered replacement systems instead. Scarcity, the force that had once justified extreme measures, would be eliminated. In House's calculation, the absence of hunger would dissolve the need for old customs. Yet hunger was not only physical, it had shaped identity. Ritual had given meaning to survival. The bargain required them to suppress instinct, memory, and habit all at once. Training began immediately. Members were instructed in the expectations of their new role. Speech patterns were corrected, movements were refined, meals were to be served, not shared. Consumption became performance rather than necessity. The act of eating shifted from ritual to service. This transition was uneven. Some adapted quickly, relieved by the predictability of their new environment. Others struggled silently. Abundance did not erase memory. For those raised within the old system, the absence of familiar ritual created a persistent sense of imbalance. The body no longer dictated action, but the mind remembered. Leadership within the tribe was tested during this period. Elders who had once interpreted tradition now had to reinterpret obedience. Their authority depended on guiding members through a transformation they themselves did not fully accept. To maintain cohesion, they reframed the bargain as strategic rather than moral. The old ways were not condemned, they were simply postponed. This reframing allowed the tribe to maintain internal continuity. Outwardly, they complied completely. Inwardly, belief was preserved in silence. Cannibalism became an unspoken past rather than a forbidden desire. Memory was compartmentalized, sealed away much like the strip itself. House's system reinforced this compartmentalization. The Ultralux was designed to isolate its inhabitants from the Mojave. Once inside, there was little reason to look outward. Comfort dulled urgency. Routine replaced improvisation. Surveillance ensured compliance without requiring constant intervention. The tribe's members were given new names, new attire, and new roles. These changes were not symbolic gestures. They were mechanisms of control. By stripping away visible markers of the past, House ensured that identity would be expressed only through approved channels. The gloves were not merely aesthetic, they were barriers, separating the individual from the memory of touch. As the weeks passed, behavior adjusted. Cannibalism, once central, was no longer enacted, but its absence created tension rather than relief. Hunger had once justified action. Now desire had no outlet. This tension did not explode. The bargain also altered power dynamics within the tribe. Those who adapted quickly gained favor. Those who struggled learned to conceal it. Obedience became the new measure of worth. Silence, already valued, became essential. House did not intervene unless necessary. His interest lay in outcome, not process. As long as the strip functioned and appearances were maintained, internal conflict was irrelevant. This indifference allowed suppressed traditions to survive beneath the surface, unchallenged and unexamined. The tribe learned that survival within House's system required duality. There was the public self, refined and compliant, and the private self, burdened with memory. Neither could be allowed to interfere with the other. To do so would risk expulsion, or worse, replacement. This duality became institutionalized. New members were taught the rules without explanation. Questions were discouraged. History was not taught, only behavior. In this way, House's bargain began to succeed. The past faded for those who never lived it. For others, it became an unspoken inheritance. The cost of the bargain was not immediate destruction, but gradual erosion. Identity was preserved only in fragments, held by those who remembered rather than shared. Cannibalism, once a communal act, became a private thought. The bargain reshaped the tribe into something new without fully destroying what came before. It demanded obedience, offered security, and imposed silence. In exchange, it granted survival in a world where survival was no longer guaranteed. What the tribe gained was stability. What it lost was cohesion built on shared necessity. In the absence of hunger, the old logic no longer applied. But logic did not disappear. It adapted, waiting beneath the surface of luxury. The agreement with House was never meant to be temporary. It was designed to last as long as New Vegas endured. For the White Glove Society, this meant living within a contradiction. They had escaped scarcity, but not memory. They had abandoned ritual, but not meaning. The bargain did not end their story. It defined the conditions under which the rest of it would unfold. The transformation that followed the agreement was not immediate, but it was thorough. They were rebranded, reshaped into something that would fit seamlessly within the vision of the strip. This process was deliberate, careful, and focused as much on appearance as on behavior. The name they had once used among themselves was discarded. It was never spoken again. In its place came a title that conveyed refinement and restraint. The White Glove Society was not meant to sound like a tribe. It suggested exclusivity, elegance, and quiet authority. The name itself functioned as a boundary, separating what they were becoming from what they had been. Clothing was the first visible change. Uniforms replaced personal garments. White gloves covered hands, erasing signs of labor and contact. Masks concealed faces, standardizing expression and eliminating individuality. These choices were not decorative alone. They enforced anonymity. Members became interchangeable, defined by role rather than personality. This uniformity served multiple purposes. To guests of the ultra-luxe, it projected order and sophistication. To House, it simplified control. To the society itself, it reinforced discipline. When everyone looked the same, deviation stood out. Conformity became effortless, while difference required explanation. Language followed appearance. Speech was refined, stripped of slang and emotional inflection. Politeness was codified. Certain phrases were encouraged. Others disappeared through disuse. Conversation became functional, never intimate. This control of language reduced the risk of memory surfacing unexpectedly. Words shape thought, and thought was now something to be managed. Ritual did not vanish, it was redirected. Where once meals had carried heavy symbolic weight, they now became performances of hospitality. Timing, presentation, and etiquette replaced older customs. The act of serving food, rather than consuming it, became central. This shift inverted the tribe's relationship with hunger. They were no longer defined by what they took, but by what they offered. The ultra-luxe itself functioned as a stage for this new identity. Its design emphasized clean lines, soft lighting, and separation from the outside world. Within its walls, the Mojave felt distant and unreal. Members of the society spent most of their time indoors, shielded from the reminders of scarcity that might weaken their resolve. Training reinforced these changes. New routines were drilled until they became automatic. Movement was practiced. Silence was maintained. Even posture was regulated. These details mattered. They ensured that the society would never appear anything less than composed. Behind this composure, memory was not erased, but it was suppressed. The rebranding effort did not address belief, it addressed behavior. Members were not asked to abandon their past internally. They were asked to ensure that it never surfaced publicly. This distinction allowed compliance without reconciliation. The gloves themselves became powerful symbols. They prevented bare skin from touching food, guests, or surfaces. This physical barrier mirrored a psychological one. It created distance between action and sensation, dulling instinct and reinforcing control. Over time, the gloves felt natural, even necessary. Masks served a similar function. Faces reveal emotion. Emotion invites questions. By hiding expression, the society minimized the risk of exposure. Guests saw refinement, not reaction. Within the society, this anonymity encouraged restraint. Individual desires were easier to suppress when no one could see them. The rebranding also altered internal hierarchy. Status was no longer derived from age or ritual knowledge. It was determined by performance. Those who adapted best rose quietly. Those who struggled learned to disappear into routine. Authority shifted from elders to administrators, individuals skilled at enforcing standards rather than preserving memory. This shift created subtle fractures. The elders retained knowledge, but their influence waned. The younger generation, raised within the ultra-luxe, learned the rules without understanding their origin. For them, cannibalism was not a memory, but an abstract prohibition, a rule without context. House did not monitor these internal dynamics closely. From his perspective, the transformation was successful. The White Glove Society appeared stable, compliant, and useful. Their past no longer interfered with the strip's operation. Yet the cost of rebranding was cumulative. By suppressing rather than resolving their identity, the society created an internal tension that had no outlet. Ritual had been replaced, but meaning had not. Hunger had been eliminated, but desire had not been examined. The rebranding achieved its purpose. The tribe disappeared, replaced by an institution that fit neatly into the strip's illusion of civilization. Guests saw elegance. House saw order. Few suspected that beneath the gloves and masks lay a history carefully contained rather than abandoned. The white glove society became what it needed to be in order to survive. But survival within a controlled environment demanded constant vigilance. The rebranding was not a single act. It was an ongoing process, maintained through routine, silence, and the careful performance of refinement. The Ultra Luxe was more than a casino. It was an environment designed to contain, shape, and regulate the white glove society without appearing to do so. Every detail of its construction served a purpose, creating a space where behavior could be guided through comfort rather than force. Within its walls, the society lived in a world carefully removed from the Mojave that had formed them. The building's isolation was intentional. Unlike other parts of the strip that invited noise and spectacle, the Ultra Luxe emphasized separation. Its entrances were controlled. Its interior spaces flowed in ways that discouraged wandering. Members of the society rarely needed to leave. Everything required for daily life existed within a limited radius, reducing exposure to the outside world and its reminders of scarcity. Luxury functioned as both reward and restraint. Soft lighting, clean surfaces, and carefully prepared meals created an atmosphere of abundance that made old survival instincts feel distant. Comfort dulled urgency. When needs were consistently met, there was little reason to question the system providing them. For the White Glove Society, this environment acted as a cultural cage. It protected them from the wasteland while limiting their ability to re-engage with it. The routines of service, maintenance, and hospitality filled each day, leaving little time for reflection. Memory survived, but it was crowded by repetition. The Ultra Luxe also reinforced hierarchy. Private spaces were assigned based on role. Access to certain areas required approval. Movement was subtly monitored, not through constant surveillance, but through design. The building itself enforced order without the need for visible authority. Guests experienced the Ultra Luxe as a place of refinement and indulgence. They saw attentive servers, quiet dining rooms, and an absence of disorder. What they did not see were the living quarters tucked away from public view, where members of the society retreated after their shifts. These spaces were functional rather than luxurious, reinforcing the divide between appearance and reality. Food, abundant and carefully curated, played a central role in this environment. Meals were regular, varied, and rich. For a people once defined by hunger, this consistency was disorienting. The act of preparing and serving food became constant, but consumption was controlled. Eating occurred on schedule, without ritual, stripped of its former significance. This inversion was subtle but powerful. The society was surrounded by food at all times, yet disconnected from it emotionally. They handled it, presented it, and watched others enjoy it. Desire was managed through distance. Over time, this created a sense of detachment, reducing the intensity of instinct without eliminating it entirely. The Ultra Luxe's atmosphere encouraged silence. Loud voices felt out of place. Sudden movement drew attention. Calm behavior was rewarded implicitly, while disruption stood out immediately. This reinforced the society's existing preference for restraint, turning it into an environmental expectation. The building also served as a buffer between the society and the strip's other families. Interaction was limited and formal. Relationships remained transactional. This isolation prevented the exchange of ideas that might destabilize House's design. Each family remained contained within its assigned role, reducing the risk of collective dissent. For newer members of the White Glove Society, the Ultra-Luxe was the only world they knew. Raised within its walls, they experienced abundance as normal and the wasteland as an abstraction. Stories of hunger and ritual felt distant, disconnected from lived experience. Yet containment has limits. While the Ultra-Luxe constrained behavior, it could not erase memory for those who carried it. The building's calm surfaces and predictable routines created an undercurrent of tension. The more controlled the environment became, the more internal conflict had to be suppressed. House's system relied on this balance. The Ultra-Luxe did not force loyalty. It cultivated dependence. The society's survival was tied entirely to the building and the strip that sustained it. To leave was to face uncertainty. To remain was to accept containment. In this way, the Ultra-Luxe functioned as both sanctuary and prison. It offered safety, comfort, and purpose, while quietly limiting freedom and expression. The White Glove Society adapted to this space as they had adapted to the Mojave, reshaping themselves to fit the conditions imposed upon them. The building did not demand belief, it demanded routine, and through routine, it ensured that the society's transformation continued without requiring constant enforcement. The Ultra-Luxe became the physical expression of the bargain made with House, enclosing the White Glove Society within walls of luxury that both sustained and confined them. Within the Ultra-Luxe, etiquette replaced instinct as the primary mechanism of control. The White Glove Society did not rely on visible punishment or open threats to maintain order. Instead, behavior was guided by expectation, repetition, and quiet correction. Rules were rarely spoken aloud, yet everyone understood them. Politeness became mandatory. Speech was measured, deliberate, and free of emotional excess. Even disagreement was expressed through softened language, wrapped in courtesy. This constant refinement created a social environment where conflict struggled to surface. Anger felt inappropriate, urgency felt disruptive. Silence became the safest response. These expectations were enforced collectively. When a member deviated, correction rarely came from authority. It came from peers, delivered subtly through glances, pauses, or the withholding of approval. This form of regulation was effective because it did not feel imposed. It felt internal. To conform was to belong. To fail was to stand alone. Etiquette also served as a shield. By adhering to strict behavioral norms, members of the society reduced the risk of revealing their internal state. Emotion was masked by routine. Habit replaced impulse. Over time, this created a distance between thought and action that allowed uncomfortable memories to remain buried. Silence played a crucial role in this system. Certain topics were never discussed. Questions were discouraged through omission rather than prohibition. New members learned quickly that curiosity led nowhere. Information was shared only when necessary for function. Everything else remained unspoken. This silence was not empty. It was structured. It signaled respect, obedience, and understanding. To speak without purpose was seen as careless. Words were treated as tools, not expressions. This reduced the likelihood of accidental disclosure, protecting both the individual and the society as a whole. Social rituals reinforced these norms. Greetings followed precise patterns. Service interactions were brief and controlled. Even leisure was regulated, shaped by expectations of restraint. There were no spaces for loud celebration or uncontrolled expression. Calm was the default state. Over time, this environment altered perception. Members began to associate safety with silence and risk with expression. The more composed they appeared, the less attention they attracted. Attention, in turn, carried danger. To be noticed was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny threatened containment. This system proved particularly effective at suppressing dissent. Those who questioned the society's direction rarely voiced their concerns openly. The language of etiquette did not allow for such discussions. Without vocabulary, dissent remained internal, fragmented, and isolated. Leadership relied heavily on this dynamic. Rather than issuing orders, administrators modeled behavior. Their authority came from consistency, not charisma. By embodying the expected norms, they reinforced them without confrontation. For younger members raised within the ultra-luxe, etiquette was not control, it was reality. They learned politeness before they learned history, silence before speech, order before meaning. In this way, the society ensured continuity without ever addressing the past directly. Yet this restraint carried a cost. Emotion, denied expression, did not disappear, it accumulated. Desire, curiosity, and frustration were compressed beneath layers of courtesy. The system depended on constant maintenance. Any disruption risked exposing what lay beneath. House's design did not account for this accumulation. From his perspective, the society functioned as intended. The strip remained orderly, guests were satisfied. The white glove society performed its role without incident. But beneath the calm surface, tension persisted. Etiquette controlled behavior, not belief. Silence concealed memory, not desire. The system worked only as long as every member continued to perform. In this way, etiquette became both protection and pressure. It preserved the society's place within New Vegas, while slowly eroding its internal stability. What appeared tranquil was, in truth, tightly held together by habit and restraint. The white glove society learned to survive by mastering silence. But silence, like hunger, does not vanish. It waits, contained, until the structure holding it weakens. Despite the abundance that surrounded them, hunger did not vanish from the white glove society. It changed form. Where once it had been physical and immediate, it became psychological and persistent. The body was fed regularly, predictably, yet something remained unsatisfied. This absence was subtle, easy to ignore at first, but it never fully disappeared. Cannibalism had been more than a response to starvation. It had provided structure, meaning, and identity. Its removal created a gap that etiquette and luxury could not entirely fill. The society was taught new rituals, but these lacked the weight of necessity. They were performances rather than imperatives, practiced because they were required, not because they answered a need. For those who remembered the old ways, the presence of constant food was not comforting. It was disorienting. Meals arrived without effort, without risk, without consequence. The careful balance that had once governed consumption was gone. In its place was excess, and excess dulled sensation rather than satisfying it. This produced a quiet tension. Members handled food daily, preparing elaborate dishes and presenting them to guests with practiced grace. They watched others eat freely, expressing pleasure openly. For the society, consumption was regulated, controlled, and stripped of intimacy. Desire was acknowledged only through service. In private moments, memory resurfaced, not as craving, but as recollection. The old ways had been severe, but they had been purposeful. The new routines felt hollow by comparison. This contrast did not lead immediately to rebellion. The society had learned patience. Hunger, both literal and symbolic, had always been managed rather than indulged. Now, it was managed through suppression. Thought replaced action. Silence replaced expression. Not all members experienced this tension equally. Those raised entirely within the ultra-luxe adapted easily. For them, cannibalism existed only as a prohibition, a rule without context. Hunger was an inconvenience rather than a defining force. Memory did not trouble them because it was not theirs. For older members, the difference was sharper. They remembered scarcity, they remembered ritual, they remembered a time when survival required participation, not performance. These memories were not shared openly, They were guarded, carried individually rather than collectively. This isolation intensified the sense of loss. Cannibalism had once been communal, reinforcing belonging through shared action. Now, memory was solitary. Without ritual, there was no sanctioned space for acknowledgement. Desire had nowhere to go. Over time, small deviations emerged. Not acts, but thoughts. Curiosity about whether the old ways could still exist within the new environment. Speculation about whether house's rules were absolute or merely enforced through observation. These thoughts remained internal, unspoken, but they accumulated. The society's structure discouraged exploration of these questions. Etiquette provided no language for discussing hunger beyond the physical. Silence ensured that curiosity remained fragmented. No one knew how many others felt the same tension. This fragmentation was crucial. It prevented collective action. Each individual believed their discomfort was unique, a personal failing rather than a shared experience. This belief reinforced compliance. To speak would be to admit weakness, yet the tension persisted. Suppression required energy. Routine masked desire, but could not eliminate it. The more refined the society became, the more distant they grew from the instincts that had once sustained them. This distance created a sense of disconnection, not only from the past, but from themselves. House's system relied on this disconnection. As long as the society functioned outwardly, internal conflict was irrelevant. The strip measured success through appearance and output, not cohesion or contentment. The white glove society continued to serve, smile, and maintain order. Hunger remained hidden, transformed into something abstract and difficult to name. It was no longer about survival, it was about identity. In the absence of ritual, hunger became symbolic. It represented everything that had been denied expression. Memory, instinct, and tradition were compressed into a quiet dissatisfaction that could not be resolved through etiquette or abundance. This unresolved tension did not threaten the society immediately. It settled, patient and restrained, much like the people who carried it, but it altered the internal landscape. Beneath the calm surface of the ultra-luxe, something remained unfinished. The society had learned to survive without hunger, but it had not learned how to live without meaning. The old ways had provided clarity, however harsh. The new order offered comfort, but little resolution. As the strip continued to thrive, this quiet hunger endured. It did not announce itself. It waited, preserved by silence and routine, for a moment when containment would no longer be enough. As the white glove society settled into its role within the ultra-luxe, differences began to emerge that had not existed so clearly before. These were not differences of wealth or access, but of memory and adaptation. Over time, an internal division formed, subtle and rarely acknowledged, separating those who remembered the old ways from those who knew only the new order. At the upper levels of the society, leadership was composed largely of individuals who had lived through the transition. They carried memory, even if it was never spoken. They understood what had been surrendered in exchange for security. This knowledge shaped their decisions, even when those decisions appeared neutral or procedural. Below them were members who had adapted early, finding comfort in structure and relief in abundance. For these individuals, the loss of tradition felt less like erasure and more like evolution. They embraced etiquette, routine, and anonymity without conflict. Their loyalty was not to the past, but to the system that now sustained them. At the lowest levels were those born into the ultra-luxe. For them, cannibalism was not a memory or temptation. It was an abstract concept, a rule inherited without explanation. They accepted the society's customs as natural, never questioning their origin. Hunger, ritual, and scarcity were stories without weight. This generational divide created different relationships to authority. Those who remembered the old ways viewed leadership as guardians of continuity, even when continuity was suppressed. Those who adapted quickly saw leadership as administrators of order. Those born into the system saw authority as environment, something that existed rather than something imposed. These differences rarely caused open conflict. The society's structure discouraged confrontation. Instead, they manifested in quiet behaviors: who spoke and who listened, who enforced rules strictly and who allowed small deviations, who felt tension and who felt contentment. Access to information also varied. Leadership retained fragments of the tribe's history, shared selectively and often indirectly. Certain decisions were justified through language that hinted at deeper meaning without explaining it. Those who recognized these hints understood. Those who did not were unaffected. This selective knowledge reinforced hierarchy. Understanding became a form of power, even when it could not be exercised openly. Those who knew more were more cautious. Those who knew less were more confident. This imbalance shaped interactions subtly, influencing trust and suspicion within the society. The division also affected how members perceived the strip and house's authority. Some viewed House as a necessary protector, offering stability at the cost of identity. Others saw him as the architect of a better life, freeing them from a brutal past. Still others regarded him simply as part of the environment, distant and impersonal. These perspectives were never debated. Debate required language the society did not encourage. Instead, they coexisted, unexamined, shaping behavior without articulation. The internal hierarchy adapted accordingly. Advancement favored those who performed refinement convincingly and consistently. Memory was not rewarded. Silence was. Those who carried the weight of the past learned to conceal it behind flawless etiquette. Those without such weight advanced more easily, unburdened by conflict. Over time, this reinforced the erosion of shared identity. The society remained cohesive in appearance, but internally fragmented. There was no single understanding of what it meant to belong. Membership was defined by function rather than belief. House's system did not account for belief. It required obedience and stability, both of which were present. From an external perspective, the White Glove Society functioned efficiently. Guests were served. The strip remained orderly. No visible unrest emerged. Yet cohesion had shifted. Where once unity had been enforced through shared necessity and ritual, it now relied on routine and silence. This was effective, but fragile. Routine could be disrupted. Silence could be broken. The internal class divisions were not marked by uniforms or privileges. They were marked by awareness. Some carried history. Some carried rules. Some carried nothing beyond habit. This imbalance created vulnerability. Those who remembered the old ways understood the society's suppressed tension. Those who did not were unprepared for it. If the silence were ever broken, the effects would not be evenly felt. For now, the divisions remained contained. The society continued to function, its hierarchy intact and its role secure. But beneath the uniform surface, understanding was unevenly distributed, and that unevenness would matter when the balance of restraint was tested. The White Glove Society appeared unified. In reality, it was layered, shaped by who remembered, who adapted, and who never knew there was anything to forget. Within the layered structure of the White Glove Society, one figure stood apart, not through position alone, but through intention. Mortimer was not simply a member who remembered the old ways. He was someone who believed they had been wrongfully abandoned. Where others treated the past as something to be contained or endured, Mortimer treated it as something to be restored. Mortimer's authority did not come from formal rank alone. It came from conviction. He believed the society had lost more than a practice when it surrendered cannibalism. In his view, it had lost coherence, meaning, and strength. The rituals that once governed consumption had provided discipline, unity, and purpose. Without them, the society had become hollow, defined by performance rather than belief. Unlike those who quietly carried memory, Mortimer refused to let it remain dormant. He framed the old ways not as barbarism, but as tradition. It was a cultural inheritance shaped by restraint and rule. Its suppression, therefore, represented not progress, but erasure. Mortimer understood the society's new environment as well as anyone. He recognized the power of etiquette, the importance of appearances, and the reach of house's authority. This understanding did not deter him, it informed his strategy. Open rebellion would have been ineffective. The society was not built for confrontation. Change would have to come quietly, through manipulation rather than force. He positioned himself carefully, presenting outward compliance while cultivating private influence. Mortimer spoke the language of refinement fluently. He enforced rules publicly and upheld etiquette with precision. This consistency made him trustworthy in the eyes of those who valued order. It also allowed him access to spaces where deviation could occur unnoticed. Mortimer's argument was not delivered through speeches or proclamations. It was shared in fragments, passed through implication rather than instruction. He spoke of tradition as heritage, of hunger as identity, of restraint as strength rather than denial. Those who recognized these signals understood what he meant. Those who did not remained unaware. This selective communication was intentional. Mortimer did not seek mass conversion. He sought alignment among those already inclined to remember. By keeping his circle small, he avoided drawing attention. Curiosity was cultivated slowly, allowed to grow in private where silence already prevailed. To Mortimer, the society's compliance with house was not betrayal, but miscalculation. He believed the bargain had been made under conditions of fear, not reflection. Abundance had softened resolve. Etiquette had masked emptiness. The society had survived, but it no longer understood why. Cannibalism, in Mortimer's view, was the missing anchor. It had once enforced boundaries and reinforced belonging. Its ritual nature ensured discipline, not indulgence. Without it, the society had no internal gravity. It drifted, sustained by routine rather than conviction. Mortimer's preservation of the old ways was not nostalgic, it was strategic. He believed that identity could not be erased permanently, only suppressed. Suppression, he knew, created pressure. Eventually, something would surface. He intended to guide that emergence rather than allow it to erupt uncontrolled. He did not frame his efforts as defiance of house. House was distant, uninterested in internal belief. As long as the society performed its role, House's system remained intact. Mortimer planned to operate within those limits, restoring tradition without disrupting order. This required careful planning. Cannibalism could not return openly. It would have to be ritualized once more, hidden beneath layers of refinement. The society already understood secrecy. Mortimer intended to use that strength rather than oppose it. For those who followed him, Mortimer offered clarity. He named the tension others felt but could not articulate. He framed discomfort not as weakness, but as memory asserting itself. This validation was powerful. It transformed private unease into shared understanding. Yet Mortimer's vision was not universally shared. Some who remembered the old ways believed restoration was impossible or dangerous. Others feared the consequences of exposure. Mortimer accepted this resistance as necessary. Tradition, in his view, required commitment, not consensus. He waited patiently. The society had learned patience long ago. Mortimer believed time favored those who understood its rhythm. The strip appeared stable, but stability bred complacency. Complacency created opportunity. Mortimer did not see himself as a villain. He saw himself as a caretaker of truth. To allow the society to forget its origins was, to him, a form of extinction. Survival without identity was not survival at all. As the white glove society continued its flawless performance, Mortimer remained attentive, observing shifts in behavior and cracks in restraint. The old hunger had not vanished, it had simply been quieted. Mortimer intended to listen to it, shape it, and give it form once more. Beneath the composure of the White Glove Society, a quieter fear began to take shape. One that was not directed outward toward the wasteland, but inward toward disappearance. This fear was not sudden. It developed gradually, growing as the society settled more deeply into its role on the Strip. With each passing year of refinement and silence, the distance between what they were and what they had been widened. Cultural extinction does not arrive through violence alone. It can emerge through comfort, through routine, through the steady replacement of necessity with convenience. For the White Glove Society, abundance had removed the conditions that once defined them. Hunger no longer dictated action. Ritual no longer enforced belonging. Without these pressures, identity became abstract, preserved only through memory. This realization unsettled those who still remembered the tribe's origins. They understood that survival within House's system required compliance, but compliance carried a cost that was difficult to measure. As new generations grew up without knowledge of the old ways, the past lost its relevance. Memory thinned as it passed from one individual to the next, no longer reinforced by shared practice. For those born into the ultra-luxe, the society was not something that had changed. It simply existed. Etiquette, anonymity, and service were natural conditions, not adaptations. The Mojave, beyond the Strip, felt distant and unnecessary. Stories of scarcity sounded exaggerated, disconnected from lived experience. In this way, the society's origins began to fade, not through suppression, but through irrelevance. This fading created anxiety among those who valued continuity. They feared that once memory disappeared entirely, restoration would become impossible. Cannibalism, as controversial as it was, represented more than an act. It represented difference. Without it, the society risked becoming indistinguishable from any other Strip family. Its uniqueness dissolved into polished sameness. The fear was not that the society would die out physically. House ensured their material survival. The fear was that they would persist without meaning, functioning efficiently while forgetting why they existed as a distinct group at all. This prospect felt like a quieter, more complete erasure. Some members responded to this fear through increased conformity. They believed that perfect performance would secure the society's place indefinitely. Others withdrew, resigning themselves to gradual assimilation. For them, the past was already lost. The safest course was acceptance. Others, however, felt compelled to resist this erasure, even if only internally. They clung to fragments of tradition, preserving them in silence. Stories were remembered but not told. Meanings were recalled but not enacted. This preservation was passive, fragile, and dependent on individuals rather than institutions. The society's structure offered no mechanism for addressing this fear openly. There were no forums for reflection, no sanctioned discussions of identity. Etiquette did not allow for such conversations. Silence, once a tool of cohesion, now prevented resolution. House's indifference compounded the problem. He had no interest in the society's cultural survival beyond its usefulness. As long as the ultra-luxe functioned, the internal state of its inhabitants was irrelevant. This reinforced the sense that identity was expendable, something to be sacrificed for stability. The fear of extinction sharpened awareness of time. Those who remembered the old ways understood that memory alone could not endure indefinitely. Without reinforcement, it would fade with them. Each death meant the loss of unspoken knowledge. Each new member, raised without context, accelerated the process. This awareness created urgency without expression. There was no countdown, no external threat, only the quiet understanding that delay favored forgetting. The longer the society remained unchanged, the more complete its transformation became. Cannibalism, in this context, was reframed by some as preservation rather than transgression. It represented continuity in a world that demanded conformity. To abandon it entirely was to accept disappearance. To restore it, even in secret, was to assert identity against assimilation. This framing did not require widespread agreement. It required only enough individuals willing to act. Cultural survival, after all, does not depend on unanimity. It depends on transmission. As the strip continued to glow steadily, the White Glove Society faced a dilemma that House's system had never intended to address. They had achieved security, but at the cost of erosion. They were safe, but increasingly hollow. The fear that emerged was not of punishment or exposure. It was the fear that one day, the society would still exist, but no one would remember what it meant to belong. As the White Glove Society maintained its flawless exterior, small irregularities began to surface beyond its walls. They were not announced, recorded, or officially acknowledged. They appeared instead as absences, guests who did not return to their rooms, names that quietly vanished from reservation lists, individuals whose movements on the strip ended without explanation. In New Vegas, disappearance was not unusual. The Mojave was dangerous, and travelers often met uncertain ends beyond the safety of the strip. This ambiguity provided cover. When someone failed to leave the Ultra-Luxe, there were many plausible explanations. Few were willing to look closely. The society understood this advantage instinctively. Secrecy had always been part of its structure. Silence was not new. What changed was context. Within the controlled environment of the strip, disappearance took on a different meaning. It required coordination, restraint, and careful timing. Those involved did not act impulsively. Any deviation from routine risked exposure. Selection was deliberate. Outsiders without strong affiliations were preferred. Individuals whose absence would not prompt immediate inquiry. The strip's constant movement made tracking difficult. Crowds provided anonymity. Luxury created distraction. The Ultra-Luxe itself aided this concealment. Private dining rooms, restricted corridors, and controlled access points created spaces where observation was limited. Guests trusted the environment. They assumed safety where refinement existed. This trust reduced vigilance. Within the society, knowledge of these events was tightly contained. Not everyone participated. Not everyone needed to know. Compartmentalization ensured that no single individual could expose the whole. This mirrored older practices, adapted to a new environment. For many members, rumors of disappearances existed only as faint impressions. A guest mentioned once, then forgotten. A vacant room quietly reassigned. No alarms sounded. No questions were encouraged. Silence absorbed the irregularity. Those who knew more treated the matter with careful detachment. Emotion was suppressed. The act itself was framed not as violence, but as continuation. In this framing, the disappearance of outsiders was not disruption, it was restoration. The strip's other families did not intervene. As long as the Ultra-Luxe continued to function and guests remained satisfied overall, there was little incentive to investigate anomalies. House's systems monitored stability, not morality. His interest lay in order, not individual lives. Disappearances did not register as threats unless they disrupted commerce or control. The White Glove Society ensured that they did neither. This environment of indifference allowed subtle patterns to persist. Disappearances remained rare enough to avoid notice, yet frequent enough to sustain internal belief. The balance was delicate. Excess would invite attention. Restraint ensured survival. For those within the society who opposed restoration, these events created unease. They sensed deviation without understanding its extent. Etiquette prevented inquiry. Silence prevented confrontation. Suspicion remained isolated. For those aligned with preservation, each disappearance reinforced conviction. It proved that the old ways could exist within the new order. That house's system, while controlling, was not absolute. There were spaces where tradition could reassert itself. The act of concealment itself became ritualized. Planning replaced instinct. Selection followed criteria. Disposal was meticulous. Every step was designed to leave no trace beyond absence. In this way, disappearance became a form of communication within the society. It signaled that restoration was underway, quietly and carefully. Those who recognized the signs understood. Those who did not continued their routines undisturbed. The ultra-luxe remained pristine. Guests continued to dine beneath soft lighting. Music played. Glassware gleamed. The strip moved on, uninterested in what it did not see. Disappearance, in this context, was not chaos. It was order operating beneath appearance. It was the society testing the limits of containment, learning how far silence could stretch without breaking. As long as absence remained ambiguous, the system held. The white glove society continued to serve with calm precision, even as something older moved quietly through the spaces unseen, sustained by discretion and the willingness of others not to look too closely. The plan to restore the old ways did not emerge suddenly. It developed through careful observation, quiet testing, and an understanding of the limits imposed by the strip. Those aligned with restoration recognized that cannibalism could not simply return as it had existed before. The environment had changed. The audience had changed. The act would need to be transformed to survive. This transformation took shape as the Gourmet Society. The name itself was deliberate. It framed cannibalism not as necessity or taboo, but as refinement. Consumption was reimagined as art, taste, and discernment. In this framing, the act was no longer survival-driven. It was elevated, selective, and exclusive. This reframing allowed participants to reconcile the old practice with their new surroundings. Cannibalism, once rooted in scarcity, was now presented as a choice made from abundance. This distinction mattered. It aligned the act with the strip's values, rather than opposing them. Planning was meticulous. Participants understood that excess would invite scrutiny. The Gourmet Society would not operate openly. It would exist within the structure already in place, using the ultra-luxe's private spaces and reputation for discretion. The society's own emphasis on silence made this possible. Victim selection followed strict criteria. Outsiders were chosen carefully, prioritizing those whose absence would not disrupt the strip's equilibrium. Individuals without strong affiliations, without reputations that would prompt investigation. The goal was not quantity, but sustainability. The act itself was ritualized once more, though its symbolism shifted. Where earlier rituals emphasized survival and unity, the Gourmet Society emphasized control and superiority. Consumption became a statement. It inverted the strip's hierarchy, turning guests into resources and hosts into arbiters of worth. This inversion appealed to those who felt diminished by House's system. As servants and performers, members of the White Glove Society occupied a position of apparent subservience. The Gourmet Society offered a private reversal. Within its rituals, they were dominant once more. Preparation was deliberate and restrained. The act was never rushed. Precision mattered. This discipline mirrored the old ways, even as the context differed. In both cases, restraint distinguished ritual from chaos. Secrecy was paramount. Knowledge of the Gourmet Society was tightly controlled. Even within the White Glove Society, most members remained unaware. This compartmentalization ensured that exposure would be limited if disruption occurred. Mortimer played a central role in shaping this structure. He understood both the necessity of concealment and the psychology of restoration. He framed participation not as rebellion, but as fulfillment. Those who joined were not breaking rules. They were reclaiming identity. Language was carefully chosen. Cannibalism was rarely named directly. Instead, it was implied through metaphor and euphemism. This mirrored the society's broader reliance on suggestion rather than declaration, meaning traveled quietly, understood only by those meant to hear it. The gourmet society did not seek recognition. Its success depended on invisibility. There were no symbols displayed, no public rituals enacted. Everything occurred behind closed doors, beneath layers of refinement and routine. The risk was understood. Exposure would not merely threaten individuals, it would jeopardize the society's place on the strip. Yet this risk was accepted. For those involved, extinction through assimilation was a greater threat than punishment. This calculus reflected a return to earlier logic. Survival was not only about physical safety, it was about continuity. The gourmet society represented an attempt to preserve that continuity within a system that sought to erase it. The act of consumption, in this new form, carried layered meaning. It was defiance without confrontation, preservation without proclamation. It asserted that the society's past could not be fully suppressed, only redirected. The strip remained unaware. Guests continued to dine, gamble, and depart. House's systems registered no disruption. The ultra-luxe maintained its reputation for elegance and discretion. Within this calm exterior, the gourmet society operated as a hidden current, drawing strength from secrecy and belief. It demonstrated that House's control, while extensive, was not absolute. There were spaces beyond his attention, moments between routines where tradition could reassert itself. The gourmet society was not a return to the past as it had been. It was an adaptation, shaped by luxury and restraint. Cannibalism survived, not by resisting civilization, but by disguising itself within it. In this way, the plan achieved its immediate goal. The old ways lived again, not as necessity, but as identity, hidden, selective, and carefully maintained. The gourmet society represented the white glove society's quiet refusal to disappear. Within the structure of the gourmet society, cannibalism took on a meaning that extended beyond preservation. It became a language of power. In a world where the white glove society outwardly served others, the act of consumption reversed roles in secret. Those who appeared subordinate in public reclaimed dominance in private. On the strip, hierarchy was visible and rigid. Guests arrived with caps, status, and freedom of movement. The white glove society existed to accommodate them, to ensure comfort without intrusion. Politeness defined every interaction. Deference was expected. This dynamic shaped perception. The society appeared refined, but secondary. The gourmet society disrupted this arrangement quietly. By selecting guests as subjects rather than patrons, it inverted the established order. The act of consumption stripped victims of status entirely. Titles, wealth, and reputation ceased to matter. What remained was vulnerability. This inversion was not incidental. It addressed a specific imbalance created by House's system. The white glove society had traded autonomy for security. In doing so, it had accepted a visible position of service. Cannibalism, reintroduced in secrecy, restored a sense of control that etiquette denied. Power within the gourmet society was expressed through restraint. Participation required discipline, planning, and silence. Those who acted impulsively were excluded. This exclusivity reinforced hierarchy within the group itself. Only those who demonstrated composure and loyalty were permitted to partake. The act of consumption was framed as judgment rather than indulgence. Victims were chosen not randomly, but according to criteria that emphasized disposability. Outsiders without strong ties. Individuals unlikely to be missed. In this selection process, the society positioned itself as arbiter of worth. This framing aligned with older beliefs. In the past, cannibalism had reinforced belonging by distinguishing between those inside and those outside the tribe. The gourmet society preserved this boundary, translating it into a new context. Guests, despite their wealth, remained outsiders. The secrecy surrounding these acts amplified their significance. What occurred behind closed doors carried more weight precisely because it was hidden. Knowledge became currency. To be included was to be trusted. To be excluded was to remain unaware. This secrecy also created a sense of superiority. Members of the gourmet society moved through the ultra-luxe, knowing something others did not. This knowledge fostered detachment. Public interactions became performances layered over private conviction. The act itself reinforced this detachment. Cannibalism required participants to compartmentalize behavior completely. Politeness and violence could not coexist in the same space. The ability to switch between these states became a measure of control. For some, this duality was intoxicating. It offered relief from the constraints of constant refinement. For others, it was simply necessary, a way to reconcile identity with environment. In both cases, the act restored a sense of agency absent from daily service. House's system did not recognize this power shift because it did not manifest publicly. Stability remained intact. Commerce continued. The strip functioned as designed. From a distance, nothing had changed. Yet within the society, perception shifted. Members involved in the gourmet society no longer saw themselves solely as servants of the strip. They understood their role as conditional, maintained by choice rather than submission. This understanding altered behavior subtly, though never overtly. Power, in this context, was not about overthrowing House or disrupting the strip. It was about reclaiming significance. The gourmet society allowed its members to feel rooted once more, connected to a tradition that predated luxury and surveillance. This restoration of power was fragile. It depended entirely on secrecy and restraint. Exposure would collapse the illusion instantly. Participants understood this risk and accepted it. Power, to them, was worth danger. The gourmet society did not seek expansion. Growth increased risk. Instead, it maintained exclusivity, ensuring that control remained concentrated. This mirrored earlier tribal structures, adapted to the constraints of the ultra-luxe. In this way, cannibalism became both symbol and instrument. It symbolized resistance to assimilation and functioned as a private assertion of dominance. The white glove society, constrained by etiquette and service, reclaimed agency through an act that inverted the strip's hierarchy without challenging it directly. What emerged was not chaos, but a parallel structure of meaning. Publicly, the society remained refined and compliant. Privately, it exercised power through secrecy and consumption. The strip continued to glitter, guests continued to dine, and beneath this calm surface, the white glove society quietly reminded itself that it was not merely part of House's design, but something older, still capable of choosing who was consumed and who was spared. The arrival of the courier introduced an element the white glove society had not accounted for. Unlike guests who passed briefly through the ultra-luxe, the courier did not move according to expected patterns. They asked questions. They returned to places others left behind. Their presence disrupted routines simply by refusing to remain superficial. The strip was accustomed to outsiders, but most followed predictable paths. They gambled, dined, and departed. In a system built on repetition and assumption, unpredictability carried weight. For the white glove society, the courier represented a variable beyond etiquette. Politeness could not redirect curiosity indefinitely. Silence, effective against internal dissent, was less effective against someone with no stake in conformity. The courier did not share the society's history or its fear of exposure. As interactions continued, the carefully maintained boundaries within the ultra-luxe began to strain. Conversations that would normally remain brief extended longer than expected. Requests were made that fell outside routine. Information that was usually compartmentalized began to overlap. Mortimer recognized the risk immediately. The courier's presence threatened not only secrecy, but control. Where others accepted appearances, the courier probed beneath them. This curiosity could not be managed through refinement alone. At the same time, the courier presented opportunity. Outsiders had always been central to the gourmet society's logic. They were both resource and boundary marker. The courier, however, was different. Their actions carried consequence. They had influence beyond the ultra-luxe, connections that extended across the Mojave. This duality made the courier dangerous. They could expose the gourmet society, or they could be guided to serve its purpose. Mortimer understood that neutrality was not an option. The society would need to act. The approach was cautious. Mortimer framed requests carefully, appealing to the courier's sense of curiosity rather than obligation. Information was revealed selectively, enough to intrigue without alarming. The existence of the gourmet society was implied rather than declared. For the courier, these interactions offered a glimpse beneath the strip's surface. The refinement of the ultra-luxe began to feel performative rather than natural. Small inconsistencies emerged, hints of something unresolved beneath the gloves and masks. The courier's investigation brought dormant tensions into motion. Members of the White Glove Society who opposed restoration sensed danger. Silence, once protective, now felt inadequate. They feared exposure, punishment, and replacement. For them, the courier embodied disruption without allegiance. For those aligned with Mortimer, the courier represented potential validation. If the gourmet society could persist even under scrutiny, it would confirm the limits of House's control. If it failed, at least the question would be resolved. House's systems did not intervene. From his perspective, nothing had changed. The strip continued to function. The courier's movements, though notable, did not yet threaten stability. This indifference allowed events to unfold unchecked. As the courier moved through the ultra-luxe, routines were tested. Doors that were usually closed were opened. Conversations that never occurred took place. The society's internal divisions became more pronounced. The presence of the courier forced choice. Continued suppression risked exposure through inaction. Restoration risked exposure through action. Either path carried consequence. For the first time since the agreement with House, the White Glove Society faced a situation that could not be managed solely through silence and routine. An outsider had entered the system who did not respond to its rules. The courier did not intend to challenge the society's identity. Yet by existing within its space without adopting its assumptions, they destabilized it. The carefully balanced structure of secrecy and restraint was no longer sufficient. The society stood at a threshold. Its hidden practices, preserved through discretion and indifference, were now subject to attention. The arrival of the courier did not create conflict. It revealed it. What followed would not be determined by hunger or memory alone, but by decision. For the White Glove Society, the moment had arrived when adaptation would no longer be passive. The system would either hold, or it would be forced to change. And in that quiet tension, beneath chandeliers and soft music, the future of the society began to turn. The moment the courier became aware of the White Glove Society's internal fracture, the future of the group ceased to be singular. What followed was no longer a quiet continuation of routine, but a branching set of possibilities, each shaped by choice rather than habit. The society, long sustained by suppression and silence, was forced into a state of exposure. The courier's involvement brought clarity where ambiguity had once protected the society. Questions demanded answers. Absence required explanation. The gourmet society, carefully hidden within the ultra-luxe, could no longer rely on invisibility alone. Its survival now depended on how it responded to scrutiny. One possible path lay in exposure. If Mortimer's activities were revealed fully, the society would be compelled to confront its own contradictions. Cannibalism, reframed as refinement, would be stripped of disguise. The illusion of control would collapse under attention. House's tolerance for deviation extended only as far as stability. Once disrupted, replacement would be considered. In this outcome, Mortimer's vision failed, not because it lacked conviction, but because it misjudged containment. The society's secrets, once revealed, would no longer function as identity. They would become liability. Those who remembered the old ways would be silenced, removed, or marginalized. The society would survive, but emptied of its past. Another path involved concealment reinforced. If Mortimer's plans were interrupted quietly, the gourmet society could be dismantled without public consequence. Cannibalism would be suppressed once more, not erased, but contained deeper than before. The society would reaffirm its compliance with House's expectations, prioritizing stability over continuity. In this outcome, the society retained its place on the strip. Order prevailed. Silence thickened. Memory became even more isolated, confined to fewer individuals. Cultural extinction continued, slower but inevitable. A third possibility emerged through complicity. If the courier chose not to intervene, the gourmet society could persist unchecked. Cannibalism would remain hidden, ritualized, and selective. The society would maintain its dual existence indefinitely, outwardly refined and inwardly divided. This path preserved tradition at the cost of cohesion. The society would continue to function, but under constant tension. Each act of concealment would reinforce separation between those who knew and those who did not. Identity would survive, but only in fragments. None of these outcomes offered resolution. Each carried loss. Exposure erased secrecy. Suppression erased meaning. Continuation erased unity. The society could not return to what it had been, nor fully become what House intended. House's response remained distant. He did not intervene directly. From his perspective, the strip endured. The society's fate mattered only insofar as it affected function. This indifference allowed outcomes to settle quietly, without ceremony or declaration. For the White Glove Society, the courier's involvement marked the end of inevitability. For the first time since their transformation, survival was not simply a matter of adaptation, it required decision. These decisions were not made publicly. There were no votes or announcements. Outcomes emerged through action and omission, through what was exposed, what was silenced, and what was allowed to continue. The society adapted once more, as it always had. But adaptation now carried awareness. The illusion of permanence was gone. The members understood, whether they acknowledged it or not, that identity could be altered, preserved, or lost entirely, depending on how closely it was guarded. The branching futures did not resolve into a single truth. They coexisted as possibilities, reflecting the unstable foundation upon which the society stood. The courier's presence had not destroyed the White Glove Society. It had revealed its fragility. From this point forward, the society's survival would no longer depend solely on hunger or abundance, but on the careful management of choice. In the outcome where cannibalism was ended, the White Glove Society returned to a familiar posture of restraint. The disruption caused by the courier's presence settled into routine once more. The Gourmet Society dissolved quietly, without announcement or acknowledgement. What had surfaced was pushed back beneath layers of etiquette and silence. This suppression was thorough. Any remaining traces of ritual were removed. Private spaces were reassigned. Conversations ceased. The society reaffirmed its commitment to House's expectations, presenting itself as refined, orderly, and unremarkable. Stability was restored, at least in appearance. For House, this outcome was satisfactory. The Ultralux continued to function. Guests were served. The strip remained controlled. No replacement was required. From his perspective, the system had corrected itself. Within the society, the effects were more complex. Those who had participated in or supported restoration retreated into silence. Memory did not disappear, but it became dangerous to acknowledge. Knowledge that had once bound a small group together now isolated them. Leadership responded by tightening standards. Deviations were corrected quickly. Silence deepened. These measures were not punitive, they were preventative. The society had learned how close exposure could come. For members who opposed cannibalism's return, this outcome brought relief. The threat of replacement or punishment had passed. The society's place on the strip was secure. Routine resumed, without fear of sudden collapse. For others, the cost was heavier. The suppression of cannibalism felt final. The opportunity to restore identity had been lost. What remained was compliance without conviction. Survival continued, but meaning thinned further. The generational divide widened. Younger members remained largely unaffected. They continued to perform their roles with ease, unaware of what had been at stake. For them, the society had simply weathered an internal disturbance and returned to normal. Those who remembered the old ways experienced a quieter loss. Without ritual or shared acknowledgement, memory became personal rather than collective. Tradition could no longer be transmitted through practice. It existed only in recollection, vulnerable to fading. This isolation altered behavior subtly. Members carrying memory became more cautious, less expressive. They understood that survival now depended on concealment not just from house, but from one another. Trust narrowed. Over time, leadership shifted toward those without attachment to the past. Advancement favored individuals who embodied refinement without hesitation. Memory was no longer useful. Silence was. The white glove society grew more efficient as a result. Without internal tension surfacing, performance improved. The ultra-luxe operated smoothly, its reputation intact. Guests saw only elegance and order, yet this efficiency came at the cost of cohesion. The society remained unified in appearance, but internally hollow. Identity, once forged through shared necessity and ritual, had been replaced entirely by role and routine. House's system functioned as intended. The society became an interchangeable component of the strip, valuable for its service rather than its culture. In this form, it was stable but expendable. The suppression of cannibalism did not create peace. It created quiet. Desire did not vanish. It lost its outlet. Hunger, once symbolic and ritualized, became abstract dissatisfaction without expression. As years passed, memory continued to erode. Those who carried it aged and disappeared. Without reinforcement, the old ways faded, not through violence or prohibition, but through neglect. The white glove society endured, refined and orderly, its past increasingly irrelevant. It survived within House's design, not as a distinct culture, but as a function. In this outcome, extinction did not arrive as collapse. It arrived as comfort. The society remained, but what it had once been existed only in fragments, scattered among individuals who no longer spoke of it. The strip continued to glow steadily. The ultra-luxe remained pristine, and beneath the polished surfaces, the white glove society persisted, stable, compliant, and quietly diminished. In the outcome where cannibalism returned and remained concealed, the white glove society settled into a fragile equilibrium. Nothing changed on the surface. The ultra-luxe continued to project refinement. Guests dined, laughed, and departed unaware. House's systems detected no instability. From the outside, the society appeared unchanged. Internally, however, the restoration altered everything. The gourmet society did not expand, nor did it retreat. It stabilized, existing as a quiet undercurrent rather than a movement. Cannibalism resumed not as necessity, but as ritualized affirmation, practiced sparingly and selectively. This concealment required constant discipline. Each act reinforced the importance of silence. Knowledge remained tightly compartmentalized. Only those essential to the process were informed. The majority of the society continued their routines untouched, unaware of what occurred beyond their roles. For those involved, the return of cannibalism brought clarity. Hunger, once abstract, regained meaning. Identity, long suppressed, found expression again. The act restored a sense of continuity with the past, even as it adapted to the present. This restoration did not produce unity, it deepened division. The society existed in layers, with belief and ignorance coexisting uneasily. Those who participated moved through the ultra-luxe with heightened awareness, conscious of the dual reality they inhabited. This duality shaped behavior subtly. Public refinement became more deliberate, almost ritualistic in itself. Politeness served as camouflage. The better the performance, the safer the secret. Etiquette became not just expectation, but necessity. House's indifference allowed this arrangement to persist. Stability remained intact. The strip functioned. The white glove society fulfilled its role. As long as these conditions held, House had no reason to intervene. Yet concealment carried cost. Each act required careful calculation. Excess risked exposure. Mistakes could unravel everything. Participants understood that survival depended on restraint as much as conviction. Over time, the act of concealment became its own tradition. Planning, selection, and silence were ritualized. Cannibalism survived not through abundance, but through limitation. This mirrored the old ways more closely than abundance ever had. The society's internal hierarchy adjusted accordingly. Influence flowed quietly toward those who carried knowledge. Authority was informal, unspoken, and contingent. Power resided not in rank, but in awareness. For those outside the gourmet society, nothing seemed amiss. The ultra-luxe remained tranquil. The society's public cohesion masked its internal fracture. Ignorance preserved stability. This outcome preserved tradition without restoring unity. The society remained divided between those who knew and those who did not, bound together by performance rather than belief. Cannibalism's return did not challenge House's authority. It existed alongside it, exploiting gaps rather than confronting structure. The society learned that control did not require dominance, it required discretion. The future in this outcome was uncertain but sustainable. As long as secrecy held, the society could continue indefinitely, neither fully assimilated nor fully restored. It existed between states, defined by contradiction. The strip continued to shine. The ultra-luxe continued to serve. Beneath the surface, the white glove society endured, carrying its past quietly forward, concealed within the very refinement designed to erase it. Throughout every possible outcome faced by the white glove society, one constant remained unchanged. Robert House did not intervene. His absence was not oversight, it was design. House's authority over the strip was absolute in structure but distant in application. He governed systems, not beliefs. House had never intended to manage culture. His vision for New Vegas was mechanical in nature, built on predictable inputs and controlled outputs. As long as a group fulfilled its assigned function, its internal state was irrelevant. The white glove society existed to project refinement, maintain order, and support the strip's illusion of excess. Whether its members believed in that illusion did not matter. This indifference shaped everything. The society was not judged by morality, tradition, or cohesion. It was measured by stability. Guests were served. Violence remained contained. Commerce flowed. In House's calculations, these were the only meaningful variables. Cannibalism, whether suppressed or concealed, did not register unless it disrupted these outcomes. House did not monitor individual lives. He monitored patterns. As long as disappearances remained rare and untraceable, they were statistically insignificant. This distance created space. It allowed the White Glove Society to adapt internally without triggering external correction. House's control was powerful but narrow. He enforced behavior, not intent. This distinction allowed tradition to survive beneath compliance. House also understood replaceability. No family on the Strip was permanent. Each existed at his discretion. This knowledge exerted pressure without requiring enforcement. The society understood that failure would not bring negotiation, only removal. Yet, House did not threaten replacement lightly. Replacement was inefficient. It required disruption. As long as the society performed adequately, he preferred continuity. This preference favored concealment over confrontation. House's indifference was not neutral. It rewarded those who understood how to operate within it. The White Glove Society, shaped by secrecy long before House's arrival, was uniquely suited to this environment. They understood silence. They understood compartmentalization. They understood how to preserve internal truth while presenting external conformity. This compatibility was not intentional. House had selected the tribe for its discipline, not its past. Yet that past made them adaptable in ways House likely never examined. House's systems enforced obedience through environment rather than ideology. The ultra-luxe provided comfort and constraint. Surveillance ensured order without scrutiny of motive. This approach minimized resistance while maximizing output. For the society, House's indifference was both protection and threat. It allowed internal variation to exist, but offered no support if that variation surfaced publicly. The society learned that survival depended entirely on self-regulation. House did not ask the society to forget. He did not ask them to believe. He asked them to function. This simplicity made his rule effective. As years passed, the White Glove Society adapted itself around this absence of concern. Decisions were made not in response to House's judgment, but in anticipation of his disinterest. Exposure, not disobedience, became the greatest risk. House remained sealed away, calculating probabilities while the society navigated identity beneath chandeliers and soft light. His indifference created a vacuum in which tradition could either fade or hide. In the end, House did not shape the White Glove Society's fate directly. He set the conditions and stepped back. What the society became within those conditions was left to silence, memory, and restraint. The Strip continued to function as designed, and within that design, the White Glove Society endured, not because House cared what they were, but because he did not. Within the carefully managed ecosystem of the Strip, the White Glove Society did not exist in isolation. It functioned alongside other families, each shaped by House's vision and constrained by his rules. These families shared a common origin as tribes reshaped into roles, yet their paths diverged sharply. In comparison, the White Glove Society's struggle was quieter, less visible, but no less consequential. The chairman embraced performance openly. Their identity revolved around entertainment, charisma, and controlled excess. They adopted the appearance of the old world's glamour without questioning its substance. Their transformation required little suppression because their tribal past did not conflict sharply with their new role. They became what they were asked to become with minimal internal resistance. The Omertas followed a different path. Their aggression and ambition were never fully subdued. They complied outwardly while cultivating overt hostility beneath the surface. Where the White Glove Society concealed instinct through refinement, the Omertas concealed intention through deception. Their defiance was louder, more dangerous, and ultimately more visible. In contrast, the White Glove Society internalized its conflict. Its past did not manifest as ambition or rebellion, but as memory and ritual. Where the omertas sought power openly and the chairman sought spectacle, the white gloves sought preservation. Their resistance, when it existed, was symbolic rather than strategic. All three families demonstrated different responses to assimilation. The chairman surrendered identity for comfort. The omertas rejected submission while pretending compliance. The white glove society complied while refusing to forget. Each path carried consequence. House tolerated these differences as long as stability held. His system did not demand uniformity of belief, only uniformity of outcome. This allowed the strip to function as a collection of controlled contradictions, each family embodying a different compromise between past and present. The white glove society's approach was the most subtle. It did not threaten House's authority directly. It did not seek to expand influence beyond its assigned space. Its actions, when they occurred, were inward-facing, focused on identity rather than domination. This inward focus made the society appear harmless by comparison. While the omertas plotted disruption and the chairman distracted with excess, the white gloves maintained calm refinement. Their danger lay not in ambition, but in concealment. The contrast between the families revealed House's limitations. His system could suppress overt rebellion, but it could not resolve internal contradiction. Each family carried remnants of its tribal origin, reshaped but not erased. For the white glove society, this comparison reinforced both fear and resolve. They saw what happened when defiance became visible. They also saw how easily identity could dissolve when performance replaced meaning. Their path lay between these extremes. The society learned from observation. Loud resistance invited destruction. Complete surrender invited disappearance. Silence allowed endurance. By remaining refined and discreet, they avoided the fate of both extremes. The strip's balance depended on this diversity of compromise. Each family played its role, maintaining the illusion of civilization while carrying unresolved pasts beneath it. The white glove society's struggle was simply less visible. Within this system, comparison served as reminder. The society understood that its survival depended not on dominance or spectacle, but on restraint. It did not need to outshine the others. It needed only to remain indispensable and unnoticed. In the presence of louder conflicts, quiet ones were ignored. This neglect allowed the white glove society to persist, its internal contradictions hidden behind immaculate service. The strip continued to thrive, each family reflecting a different outcome of forced assimilation. Among them, the white glove society stood as the most controlled, the most concealed, and perhaps the most unresolved. The symbols adopted by the white glove society were not arbitrary. Every element of their appearance served a purpose, shaping perception while suppressing history. The gloves, the masks, the immaculate uniforms were more than decoration. They were instruments of erasure, carefully chosen to distance the society from its origins. The gloves were the most constant symbol, always worn, never removed in public. They prevented direct contact between skin and world. This barrier was physical, but it was also psychological. Touch carries memory. By denying it, the society reduced the risk of instinct resurfacing. Hands that once carried ritual now served plates, clean and distant. The color white reinforced this separation. It suggested purity, cleanliness, and control. In a wasteland defined by decay, white signaled transcendence. It implied that the society had risen above the conditions that shaped it. This implication was critical. Guests needed to believe that refinement was genuine, not performed. Masks completed the transformation. Faces reveal emotion, and emotion invites inquiry. By concealing expression, the society removed individuality from interaction. Members became interchangeable, defined by role rather than self. This anonymity made discipline easier to enforce and dissent harder to identify. The masks also erased lineage. Without visible features, generational continuity was obscured. Members appeared timeless, detached from age or background. This supported the illusion that the society had always existed in its current form, free of history. Together, gloves and masks created a uniform identity that prioritized function over belief. The society did not need to convince itself of refinement. It needed to perform it convincingly. Symbols ensured consistency even when conviction wavered. These symbols also shaped internal perception. Over time, members began to associate their attire with safety and belonging. Removing gloves or masks felt wrong, even dangerous. The uniform became armor, protecting individuals from exposure, both external and internal. This reliance on symbolism reduced the need for explicit enforcement. Behavior aligned naturally with appearance. To dress refined was to act refined. The ritual of preparation reinforced compliance, turning identity into routine. Yet symbols also concealed absence. The gloves hid what hands had once done. The masks hid expressions that might betray memory. The uniform hid difference. What was presented as unity was, in reality, suppression. For newer members, these symbols carried no contradiction. They were simply part of the society's culture. Meaning was assumed rather than questioned. The symbols did not erase identity because identity had already been reshaped. For those who remembered the past, the symbols were reminders of loss. Each glove worn marked a boundary between what had been and what could no longer be acknowledged. Each mask reinforced silence. House's system relied on these symbols without understanding them. To him, they were aesthetic choices, contributing to the strip's illusion of civilization. He did not consider what they concealed. The society understood. It had chosen these symbols because they worked. They enforced restraint without force. They erased history without destruction. They allowed survival within House's design. In time, the symbols became inseparable from the society itself. To imagine the white glove society without gloves or masks was to imagine something unrecognizable. The erasure was complete, at least in appearance. Yet symbols cannot destroy memory entirely. They can only cover it. Beneath gloves and masks, hands and faces remained unchanged. Identity persisted, silent and contained. The white glove society wore its symbols faithfully, knowing they were both protection and prison. They preserved the society's place on the strip while ensuring that what lay beneath remained unseen. In this balance between concealment and performance, the society endured, defined as much by what its symbols hid as by what they displayed. Cannibalism within the white glove society was never only literal. From its earliest form in the Mojave to its concealed presence beneath the ultra-luxe, it reflected a broader pattern that extended beyond flesh. It mirrored how the strip itself functioned, consuming resources, identities, and histories in order to sustain an illusion of permanence. The strip was built on extraction. Power, water, caps, and labor flowed inward, drawn from the surrounding wasteland. In return, little was given back beyond spectacle and controlled access. This imbalance was accepted as the price of civilization. The strip survived by feeding on what lay beyond its walls. In this context, the white glove society's tradition appeared less aberrant and more honest. Where others consumed indirectly through commerce and control, the society's cannibalism acknowledged consumption openly, even if concealed. It recognized that survival in the post-war world required taking from others, whether visibly or not. This recognition created discomfort. Civilization preferred abstraction, trade replaced force, currency replaced hunger. The strip hid its dependence behind lights and music. Cannibalism stripped away that abstraction, revealing the transaction beneath. For the white glove society, this awareness shaped identity. Their rituals did not deny the cost of survival. They structured it. Consumption was regulated, deliberate, and acknowledged. In contrast, the strip consumed without reflection, treating extraction as normal and invisible. This contrast did not make the society virtuous. It made it reflective. The act of consumption carried meaning, while the strip's consumption relied on distance and denial. Guests rarely considered where food came from, who maintained infrastructure, or what was lost beyond the walls. The White Glove Society, serving meals daily, witnessed this denial firsthand. They prepared food that symbolized abundance, while remembering a time when every resource carried consequence. This awareness sharpened the tension between appearance and reality. Cannibalism also functioned metaphorically within the society's structure. Knowledge was consumed selectively, memory was absorbed and withheld. Identity itself became something to be preserved through careful distribution rather than shared openly. House's system consumed culture in a similar way. Tribes were stripped of names, rituals, and autonomy, then reshaped into themed families. What was useful was retained. What was inconvenient was discarded. The process was efficient and unacknowledged. The White Glove Society's resistance lay in recognizing this pattern. By preserving cannibalism, even in altered form, they preserved an understanding of cost. They refused to let survival become invisible. This refusal did not challenge House's authority directly. It existed alongside it, highlighting the difference between control and understanding. The metaphor extended further. Guests consumed the strip as experience, taking pleasure without consequence. The strip consumed the wasteland for sustainability. The White Glove Society consumed outsiders to preserve identity. Each layer fed on another, creating a hierarchy of consumption that sustained New Vegas. This hierarchy was rarely acknowledged. To do so would disrupt the illusion of civilization. Cannibalism threatened that illusion because it made consumption explicit and personal. For those within the society who embraced the gourmet society, this metaphor justified their actions. They were not behaving monstrously. They were participating in the same logic that governed the strip, only without abstraction. For those who opposed it, the metaphor was equally troubling. They feared that acknowledging consumption would erode the fragile civility House had imposed. Silence felt safer than honesty. The strip preferred silence. It functioned best when costs remained unseen. The White Glove Society's tradition disrupted that preference, even when concealed. In this way, cannibalism became a mirror rather than an exception. It reflected the strip's underlying dependence on extraction and control. It exposed the difference between survival acknowledged and survival disguised. The society understood this, even if it never articulated it. Their rituals preserved a truth that civilization preferred to forget, that survival always comes at a cost, and that cost is always paid by someone. Whether cannibalism was suppressed or concealed, this understanding lingered. It shaped how the society viewed its role within New Vegas. They were not simply hosts, they were participants in a larger system of consumption. The strip continued to glow, sustained by layers of extraction and denial. Beneath it, the White Glove Society carried a quieter knowledge, one that connected hunger, power, and survival into a single, unresolved truth. In a world rebuilt on ruins, consumption was inevitable. The question was not whether it occurred, but whether it was acknowledged. The White Glove Society, in its own way, refused to let that question disappear. The greatest violence practiced by the White Glove Society was not found in ritual or secrecy, but in silence. Long before any act was committed, harm was enabled through omission, restraint, and the careful refusal to acknowledge what was occurring. Silence functioned as a shield, protecting the society while allowing actions to continue unchallenged. Within the ultra-luxe, politeness discouraged inquiry. Questions were softened until they lost force, then abandoned entirely. To remain silent preserved order. This silence was not passive. It was maintained through habit and expectation. Members learned early that noticing too much was dangerous. Curiosity had no reward. The safest response to uncertainty was composure. Disappearance relied on this discipline. Guests vanished not because no one noticed, but because no one asked. Absence was absorbed into routine. Rooms were cleaned, tables were reset, life continued. Those who suspected more understood the cost of speaking. Silence had always been protection. Over time, silence became moral camouflage. It allowed individuals to separate themselves from consequence. If something was not acknowledged, it did not require response. Responsibility dissolved into routine. This mechanism extended beyond the society itself. Other families on the Strip practiced similar restraint. Interference invited scrutiny. Silence maintained boundaries. In this environment, violence did not need to be hidden aggressively. It needed only to be unspoken. House's system reinforced this. He did not ask questions that disrupted order. His surveillance measured outcomes, not causes. As long as stability persisted, silence was rewarded. For the white glove society, this created a dangerous equilibrium. Actions that might otherwise provoke resistance continued unchallenged. Silence normalized deviation. What began as exception risked becoming routine. Yet, silence also concealed dissent. Those opposed to restoration found themselves unable to speak. Etiquette denied them language. Fear denied them courage. In this way, silence protected both sides, preventing conflict while deepening division. Violence, in this context, was not loud or chaotic. It was quiet, procedural, and contained. It occurred within a system that prized calm above justice. The society learned that restraint could be as destructive as action. By refusing to confront wrongdoing, they allowed it to persist. Silence became complicity. This realization unsettled some members deeply. They recognized that survival had required surrendering moral agency. To remain part of the society meant accepting what went unspoken. Others found comfort in this arrangement. Silence absolved them of responsibility. As long as they did not know, they were not required to act. Ignorance became refuge. The ultra-luxe continued to function smoothly. Guests felt safe. The Strip thrived. Silence preserved the illusion of civility. But beneath that illusion, harm accumulated. Each unasked question reinforced the system. Each unspoken doubt weakened cohesion. Silence held everything together, even as it eroded trust. The white glove society had mastered restraint. It had learned how to survive by withholding speech and emotion. Yet this mastery came at a cost that could not be measured easily. In the absence of open conflict, violence found quieter forms. It hid within politeness, behind closed doors, beneath immaculate service. Silence, once a tool of survival, became a force in itself. It shaped behavior, justified inaction, and allowed harm to persist without resistance. The society did not collapse under this weight. It endured. But endurance built on silence demanded constant suppression. What was never spoken did not disappear. It waited, carried by those who understood the cost of remaining quiet. After the courier departed and the immediate tension subsided, the white glove society returned to routine, but it did not return unchanged. The events surrounding exposure, suppression, or concealment left a permanent mark. Regardless of outcome, the society entered a new phase defined by awareness rather than habit. Those who had witnessed how close the system came to collapse understood that stability was conditional. Silence had held, but it had been tested. The illusion of permanence was gone. From this point forward, the society no longer believed itself immune to disruption. If cannibalism had been suppressed, the society became more cautious than ever. Etiquette tightened. Deviations were corrected swiftly. Surveillance, both formal and informal, increased. The society learned how easily attention could unravel containment and resolved not to repeat the risk. If cannibalism persisted in secrecy, restraint became doctrine, selection grew rarer, planning became meticulous. Each act carried the weight of memory and consequence. Survival depended on minimizing exposure. In either case, the society's relationship to the strip shifted subtly. They no longer viewed themselves as passive components of House's system. They understood that their position existed at the edge of tolerance. Replacement was always possible. This awareness fostered vigilance. Members watched one another more closely, though never openly. Trust narrowed. Silence deepened. The society became quieter, not louder. After the crisis, generational change continued. Younger members absorbed the refined exterior without context, unaware of how fragile it was. Older members carried the burden of knowledge, understanding what had nearly been lost or revealed. House remained distant. His lack of response reinforced the lesson that survival depended on self-regulation. No external authority would intervene to resolve internal conflict. The White Glove Society endured beyond the courier's involvement, not because it resolved its contradictions, but because it learned how to contain them more carefully. The crisis had not ended the society, it had refined it. What remained was not closure, but continuation. The society moved forward with a deeper understanding of its limits, preserving stability through heightened restraint. In this way, the White Glove Society persisted, shaped by the memory of near exposure and the knowledge that survival required constant vigilance. The question that lingered after stability returned was not whether the White Glove Society could survive, but whether survival alone was sufficient. House's design had ensured security, predictability, and abundance. What it had not provided was a framework for meaning. The society was left to reconcile this absence on its own. Moral evolution in the wasteland had never followed a single path. Some groups abandoned old practices willingly, reshaping themselves around new values. Others adapted without reflection, allowing circumstance to dictate belief. The White Glove Society occupied a more complicated position. Its transformation had been imposed rather than chosen. House had not asked the society to understand why cannibalism was forbidden. He had simply declared it incompatible with his vision. This lack of explanation mattered. Without moral reasoning, reform became behavioral rather than ethical. Actions changed, beliefs did not. For some within the society, this distinction invalidated the reform entirely. To them, cannibalism had not been wrong. It had been necessary, structured, and meaningful. Its prohibition felt arbitrary, imposed by an authority unconcerned with cultural continuity. In this view, moral evolution had not occurred, only suppression had. Others interpreted the change differently. They saw the abandonment of cannibalism as progress, a movement away from practices shaped by desperation. Abundance made old rituals unnecessary. Survival no longer demanded extreme measures. From this perspective, House had forced an evolution the society might not have achieved on its own. Between these interpretations lay unresolved tension. The society had gained security, but lost agency in determining its own values. It functioned within a moral framework it did not choose and could not challenge openly. Cultural survival complicated this further. Identity had once been reinforced through shared action. Without ritual, identity became abstract, dependent on memory rather than practice. This made it fragile. Beliefs that are not enacted eventually fade. The society faced a paradox. To preserve its culture, it would need to practice it. To practice it openly would invite destruction. To practice it secretly would fracture unity. To abandon it entirely would complete erasure. House's system offered no solution to this dilemma. It was designed to prevent instability, not to nurture identity. The society was expected to function, not to reflect. This expectation shaped behavior. Members learned to measure success by appearance rather than coherence. As long as refinement was convincing, deeper questions could be ignored. This allowed daily life to proceed without confrontation. Yet the unresolved question persisted beneath routine. This question did not produce consensus. It remained internal, unspoken, and fragmented. Each member carried a personal answer shaped by memory, comfort, and belief. For those who remembered hunger, cannibalism symbolized resilience. For those raised in abundance, it symbolized unnecessary brutality. Both perspectives were valid within their experience. Neither could dominate without conflict. House's imposed reform had removed the conditions that once justified extreme practices, but it had not replaced them with shared meaning. The society existed in a moral vacuum, sustained by routine rather than conviction. This vacuum did not cause collapse, it caused stasis. The society did not progress or regress, it endured. In the wasteland, endurance was often considered victory. Yet endurance without identity raised uncomfortable questions. Survival, stripped of purpose, risked becoming hollow. The white glove society embodied this tension. It had adapted to civilization without fully internalizing it. It had abandoned tradition without replacing it. It existed between states, shaped by constraint rather than choice. Moral evolution requires agency. Cultural survival requires practice. The society had neither fully. What it possessed was control. House's vision had succeeded in preserving order. Whether it had preserved humanity was a question he did not ask. For the white glove society, this question remained unanswered. It did not threaten immediate survival. It lingered quietly, influencing behavior without expression. The society continued to serve, to refine, to conceal. It had learned how to exist within House's system. Whether it had learned how to live within, it was less certain. In this unresolved space, the white glove society persisted, its future defined not by decisive evolution or clear preservation, but by careful balance between what was surrendered and what remained remembered. When placed alongside other societies scattered across the wasteland, the white glove society appeared restrained, even gentle by comparison. Yet this appearance was deceptive. Its complexity became clearer when viewed against the broader patterns of survival that defined the post-war world. The Legion enforced identity through brutality and absolute hierarchy. Belief was not optional. Tradition was imposed through violence, leaving no room for deviation. Cultural survival was guaranteed by fear, but at the cost of individuality. The white glove society shared none of this openness. Its control was subtle, internalized, and dependent on consent rather than force. The new California Republic represented another path. Its identity was built on law, bureaucracy, and inherited ideals from the old world. It sought legitimacy through structure and continuity. In contrast, the white glove society did not attempt to restore past institutions. It adapted tradition inwardly, shaping belief around necessity rather than governance. Vault communities offered a different lesson. Sealed away from the wasteland, they preserved controlled environments at the cost of isolation. Many vaults survived physically while fracturing socially or psychologically. The white glove society mirrored this pattern on a smaller scale. The ultra-luxe functioned as a vault of luxury, isolating its inhabitants while shaping behavior through environment. Other tribal groups adapted through migration, trade, or absorption into larger factions. Identity shifted through contact and compromise. The white glove society experienced assimilation without movement. It remained physically stationary while undergoing cultural displacement. What distinguished the society was its relationship with secrecy. Most wasteland groups enforced identity through visibility. Rituals were public, authority was obvious. The white glove society relied on concealment. Its most defining practices were hidden, protected by silence rather than force. This concealment made it resilient. Without overt markers, it was difficult to challenge, yet it also made it fragile. Without shared expression, identity depended on memory alone. Across the wasteland, survival often required clarity. Groups knew who they were because they acted on it. The White Glove Society knew who it had been, but acted as something else entirely. This duality set it apart. It was neither fully assimilated nor openly resistant. It existed in a narrow space between adaptation and erasure. In this comparison, the society's quiet persistence revealed a unique outcome of forced civilization. It demonstrated that control without belief could sustain order but not resolve identity. The wasteland offered many ways to survive. The White Glove Society chose the quietest and perhaps the most uncertain. Civilization in the wasteland was never free. It demanded payment, often in forms that were difficult to measure. For the White Glove Society, the cost was not caps or labor, but identity. The security and abundance offered by the Strip came with expectations that reshaped belief, memory, and tradition. House's vision of civilization prioritized order above all else. Predictability was valued more than expression. Stability mattered more than meaning. Within this framework, cultures were adjusted until they fit, regardless of what was lost in the process. The White Glove Society accepted this exchange willingly, though not fully consciously. Hunger had been replaced by comfort, danger by routine, survival by service. These changes improved material conditions, but they also altered the society's internal logic. In the Mojave, identity had been reinforced through shared hardship. Every ritual carried consequence. Every decision mattered. Within the ultra-luxe, consequence softened. Routine absorbed risk. Meaning diffused. Civilization, as imposed by House, removed the need for difficult choices. It also removed the structures that once gave those choices significance. The society no longer decided who it was. It performed who it was told to be. This performance was convincing. Guests saw refinement, elegance, and calm. Yet beneath this success lay absence. Traditions suppressed rather than replaced left voids. Etiquette filled time, not purpose. Silence preserved order, not coherence. The cost of civilization was cumulative. Each year of compliance made restoration harder. Memory faded. Belief weakened. Identity became increasingly theoretical. The White Glove Society endured this cost because civilization offered safety. In the wasteland, safety was rare. Many groups would have accepted the same bargain without hesitation, yet acceptance did not eliminate consequence. The society learned that civilization did not destroy culture through force. It dissolved it through comfort. The absence of threat reduced urgency. Without urgency, tradition lost relevance. This realization framed every decision the society made thereafter. Survival was assured, but substance was not. Civilization had given them a place, but taken their direction. The cost had been paid gradually, unnoticed until it was nearly complete. The White Glove Society was never intended to be frightening. To those who encountered it casually, it appeared calm, orderly, even reassuring. Its danger lay not in chaos, but in how easily it blended into the idea of civilization. It demonstrated how refinement could coexist with brutality without contradiction, as long as both were carefully separated. This made the society a quiet warning rather than an obvious threat. It showed that violence did not always announce itself through disorder or spectacle. It could be managed, scheduled, and hidden behind politeness. The absence of visible conflict did not indicate the absence of harm. In the wasteland, danger was often loud. Raiders attacked openly. Factions declared their intentions through force. The White Glove Society operated differently. Its harm relied on trust, on the assumption that civility implied safety. This reliance on appearance was deliberate. The society understood that civilization trusted surfaces, clean spaces, soft voices, and controlled environments discouraged suspicion. Refinement became camouflage. The warning embedded in the society's story was not about cannibalism alone. It was about what happened when systems valued order above accountability, when stability became the only measure of success. Anything that did not disrupt it could be tolerated. House's Strip embodied this principle. As long as commerce flowed and violence remained contained, deeper questions were unnecessary. The white glove society thrived within this logic. It learned how to operate just below the threshold of concern. This threshold was not moral, it was functional. Harm that did not affect output was invisible. The society understood this and shaped its behavior accordingly. The result was a form of evil that did not feel like evil. It did not demand participation. It did not seek attention. It persisted quietly, sustained by indifference and restraint. For those within the society who recognized this, the realization was unsettling. They understood that refinement did not guarantee virtue. Silence did not guarantee peace. Civilization did not guarantee humanity. The White Glove Society warned that progress without reflection could preserve harm rather than eliminate it. By suppressing rather than confronting its past, the society allowed it to resurface in altered form. This warning extended beyond the society itself. It applied to the Strip, to House's system, and to any structure that prized appearance over understanding. Civilization could be built on denial as easily as on reform. The society survived because it learned how to avoid attention. Its warning survived because it was never fully addressed. In the end, the White Glove Society did not collapse or reform. It endured, refined, and unresolved. Its presence on the Strip served as a reminder that the most dangerous systems were often the quietest ones, operating smoothly while concealing what they consumed to remain that way. The White Glove Society never truly reached an ending. No matter which path unfolded after the courier's involvement, the society remained. It did not dissolve, revolt, or transform completely. It continued, refined and restrained, carrying forward the same contradictions that had defined it since its earliest days in the Mojave. This persistence was not accidental. The society had always survived by adapting without fully surrendering itself. In the wasteland, endurance favored those who learned how to bend without breaking. The White Glove Society mastered this skill long before the Strip existed. If cannibalism was suppressed, the society endured as an elegant institution, emptied of ritual but stabilized by routine. If it persisted in secrecy, the society endured as a divided body, its identity fractured but alive in fragments. In either case, disappearance was avoided. What changed was not existence, but substance. The Strip rewarded this kind of endurance. House's system did not require resolution, it required consistency. The society provided that, maintaining order and performance regardless of its internal state. This made it valuable, even as it remained unresolved. Time passed. Members aged. New ones were trained. The ultra-luxe continued to operate, its polished surfaces unchanged. For guests, the White Glove Society became a fixed part of the Strip's landscape, as familiar and unquestioned as the lights above the doors. For those within the society, history settled into layers. The oldest carried memory, the middle generation carried tension, the youngest carried only habit. Each layer interacted without fully understanding the others. Identity became something inferred rather than shared. This layered existence allowed the society to persist without confronting itself directly. Questions remained unanswered, but unasked. Contradictions remained unresolved, but contained. Survival continued without clarity. The society's endurance revealed something fundamental about the world House had built. As long as systems operated smoothly, deeper conflicts could remain buried indefinitely. The White Glove Society fit perfectly into this logic. It was neither openly dangerous nor fully harmless. It existed in a controlled ambiguity, refined enough to be trusted, contained enough to be ignored. In this way, the society became timeless. It no longer belonged entirely to the Mojave's tribal past or to the Strip's manufactured present. It occupied a space between, shaped by both and resolved by neither. The hunger that once defined it did not vanish. It changed form. It became desire for meaning, for continuity, for something that routine could not provide. This hunger remained, quiet and patient, much like the society itself. The Strip continued to shine, drawing travelers from across the wasteland. The ultra-luxe continued to welcome them with soft voices and immaculate service. Few ever suspected that beneath this calm exterior, history lingered, unresolved. The White Glove Society did not need to be exposed to persist. It did not need to be restored to survive. It needed only to remain unnoticed, performing refinement while containing memory. In the end, the society stood as it always had, not as a solved problem, but as a living contradiction. It survived not by choosing between past and present, but by carrying both forward in silence. And so the story of the White Glove Society did not conclude. It continued, quietly, behind gloves and masks, beneath chandeliers and soft light, enduring in the space where civilization pretended not to see what it required in order to remain intact. As the lights of the Strip continue to glow against the desert night, the White Glove Society remains in place, refined and restrained, moving quietly through halls designed to conceal more than they reveal. Their story does not resolve into certainty or judgment. It settles instead into continuation, shaped by memory, silence, and careful routine. In the wasteland, survival often demands adaptation. For the White Glove Society, adaptation did not erase the past. It taught them how to carry it unseen. Beneath gloves and masks, history lingers, neither confronted nor forgotten, preserved through restraint rather than expression. New Vegas was built to endure, not to reflect. Its systems favor order over truth, stability over understanding. Within those systems, the White Glove Society found a way to exist, refined enough to be trusted, quiet enough to be ignored. Their endurance speaks less to resolution than to balance, a balance maintained through habit and silence. As you rest, the Strip continues, its slow rhythm. Music drifts, lights shimmer, and routines repeat. Somewhere behind polished doors, the White Glove Society continues to serve, carrying forward a history that does not end, only softens at the edges. There is no final answer waiting beneath the chandeliers, only the steady continuation of a society shaped by what it learned to hide and what it could never fully leave behind.